All right, Cowboys Nation. Today we have to talk about something that is not exactly the kind of news you want to hear, especially after we were riding high on the idea of getting to 5th round compensatory picks back around Thanksgiving. Things looked really promising. There was a major development with Rico Dowdle that seemed to put the Cowboys in a position to receive the 5th round compensatory picks, and the way the compensatory pick chart works, it looked like a solid win for the draft outlook. But now, with the season officially over and the updated numbers in, the reality is that the Cowboys are no longer in line to receive those 5th round picks. And that is exactly what I'm going to break down: what happened, what went wrong, and what it means for Dallas heading into the draft, even though it is not the outcome we hoped for. I'm still excited about the draft, especially with the Cowboys holding the 1st round selections. If you're excited about that too, let me know in the comments. First, we need to make sure everyone understands what compensatory picks actually are. These are draft picks the NFL awards to teams based on players leaving in free agency. It is not about players who were cut or traded, and those types of departures do not impact the compensatory pick formula. The system is designed so that if a team loses more or better free agents than it signs, it gets compensated with additional draft capital. Over the Cap does a great job of trying to estimate the exact formula the NFL uses, but the league keeps the full details pretty private. The main factors in the formula are the annual value of the contract, known as the AP, and the percentage of snaps the player actually plays. That snap count is crucial because if a player is injured or just does not get on the field much, it reduces the value of the comp pick. Over the years, the NFL has tightened up loopholes like cutting and re-signing players, so the system is less easily manipulated than it used to be. Still, there is some margin for error in projections, especially for those players who are on the bubble of qualifying. That is why we always say these projections are good, but not perfect. Back in November, the projections showed the Cowboys were set to receive multiple compensatory picks, but also had a few that would cancel out with outgoing picks. The list included a 5th round comp pick for DeMarcus Lawrence, a 5th round comp pick for Jordan Lewis, and several 6th round compensatory picks for Brandon Cook, Chance Goulston, Chuma Dogba, and Rico Dowdle. On the other side, the Cowboys were projected to lose compensatory picks for players like Dante Fowler, Solomon Thomas, Robert Jones, and Javonte Williams, which would cancel out some of the gains. When you put it all together, it looked like the Cowboys would net to 5th round comp picks. That was the big takeaway and why so many people got excited. Rico Dowdle's strong performance in the second half of the season pushed him over the threshold to qualify, and that allowed the Cowboys to avoid having one of those 5th rounders canceled out. If that had happened, it would have been a much less favorable outcome. But the projections at the time showed the 5th rounders for Lawrence and Lewis. Unfortunately, those projections have changed, and the big reason is Jordan Lewis. Over the Cap's updated numbers now show that Jordan Lewis no longer qualifies as a 5th round comp pick. Instead, he is now projected as a 6th round comp pick. And the reason is not a complicated story, it is simply bad luck and some cruel timing that seems to haunt the Cowboys every year. Jordan Lewis suffered a season-ending foot injury in Week 16, and he had already missed for games earlier in the year due to a neck injury. Even though he had a strong season overall and played very well in Jacksonville, his snap count dropped significantly. The final tally shows he played only about 55.8% of the snaps, and that was enough to push him below the 5th round cutoff. The difference between a 5th round and 6th round comp pick for Lewis is just about 3% in snap percentage. That is all it took to cost the Cowboys a 5th round pick. Based on these projections, this is where the system can feel especially harsh because 3% is such a small margin. It is the kind of thing that feels almost unfair, but the NFL's formula is what it is. The projections are not set in stone either, so there is still a possibility that the NFL's actual calculation could differ slightly from what Over the Cap is currently showing. Sometimes the league's numbers end up being a bit different, and there have been cases where a player gets bumped up or down compared to the projections. So while the current outlook is not great, there is still a small window for adjustment. We will have to wait and see when the official compensatory picks are announced, typically right before the start of free agency in March. The Cowboys report will have the full breakdown when that happens, so make sure you are following for the update. Even though the 5th round comp pick for Jordan Lewis is now a 6th, the other compensatory picks are still projected to be what they were. DeMarcus Lawrence remains a 5th-round pick. And the 6th-round picks for Brandon Cook and Rico Dowell remain in place. In fact, Rico Dowell even moved up to a 6th-round comp pick, which is not a big change in the grand scheme of things. Chance Goulston remains a 6th-round cancellation, and Chuma Dogba is still a 7th-round cancellation. The overall result is that the Cowboys are now set to receive one 5th-round comp pick, instead of 2. Again, this is based on projections, and there is always the chance the final numbers could shift slightly. But right now the outlook is clear. One potential wrinkle that could still change things involves Robert Jones. His situation is interesting because it could impact whether the Cowboys get an additional comp pick or not. Even though it would not necessarily net them a 5th-rounder, Jones signed a 1-year deal worth $3.75 million, but he did not play at all due to a neck injury. Most of his deal, about $3 million, was base salary and signing bonus, which was paid out regardless. The remaining $750,000 was tied to per-game roster bonuses. And because he did not play, it is likely that those bonuses were not paid if those incentives are not counted in the compensatory pick calculation. It could move Jones's contract just outside the qualifying range. That would mean that the compensatory pick the Cowboys were expected to lose for him might not cancel out one of the other gains. In other words, it could mean that the Cowboys might still end up with an extra pick somewhere in the late rounds. It is a small chance, but it is one of the few remaining possibilities that could change the final compensatory pick outcome. We will have to see how the NFL ultimately treats those kinds of incentives, because sometimes they do count them and sometimes they do not. It is one of those gray areas that can be the difference between a team getting another draft asset or not, but beyond that, the other players on the edge of qualifying include names like Cooper Rush, who did not qualify for a comp pick in the projections initially. His snap count was listed at 0%, which was clearly incorrect, and it was later updated to around 11%. Still, that is not enough to qualify, and he remains outside the compensatory pick range. There were a handful of other players who were right on the edge, but did not quite meet the threshold, unless the NFL's math differs from over-the-cap's calculations. It seems unlikely that any of those players will end up counting for the Cowboys. All right, Cowboys Nation, even with the disappointment of losing one of those 5th-round compensatory picks, the draft still has the potential to be a huge win for Dallas. The Cowboys still have to first-round selections, and that alone gives them a chance to build a strong class that can make an immediate impact. The difference between one extra 5th-round pick and 2 is not negligible. But it does not change the fact that Dallas has the opportunity to come away from the draft with some real game changers. The key now is to stay flexible, to watch how the compensatory picks are officially announced, and to adjust expectations accordingly. The draft is still the biggest event on the calendar for Cowboys fans, and the team's front office will have plenty of opportunities to add talent and depth. Now, as we keep digging into this compensatory pick situation, it is worth pointing out that the one thing that can really swing things in the Cowboys' favor is if the NFL's final calculations differ even slightly from what Over the Cap has projected. Sometimes those projections are off because the league counts certain contract components differently. One of the biggest examples of this is how incentives are treated for players like Robert Jones, who had a significant portion of his deal tied to per-game roster bonuses. The question becomes whether those bonuses are counted as part of the contract value. Even if they were never earned. In theory, the NFL could decide that those incentives were likely to be paid, and therefore include them in the calculation. Or they could treat them as non-guaranteed and not count them. That difference alone could be enough to move a player from the qualifying range to outside it. And that would change which compensatory picks get canceled out. What makes this even more frustrating is that it is not just about one player. The compensatory pick formula is a delicate balance of multiple factors, and a small change in one player's qualifying status can ripple through the entire equation. For example, if Robert Jones ends up not qualifying, then the compensatory pick for Chuma Dogba would no longer be canceled out. That would mean the Cowboys would retain that pick, and it could potentially give them a third compensatory selection in the later rounds. It is the kind of outcome that could still make this whole situation feel like a win, even if the 5th-round comp pick for Jordan Lewis is lost. But again, this is all dependent on how the NFL interprets the contract details, and we won't know until the league officially announces the compensatory picks. Another angle to consider is that the compensatory pick system is not always perfectly aligned with the real impact a player has on the field. There are players who contribute significantly to a team, but do not generate the kind of contract value or snap percentage that would qualify them for a compensatory pick. That can be a bit of a shame because it means teams sometimes lose players who were important pieces, but the league does not reward them with draft compensation. In the Cowboys' case, there were a few players who just missed the cut, and that is part of why the projections have ended up where they are. Cooper Rush is one example. He signed a one-year deal, and at first it looked like he might be in the running. But his snap count and contract value were not enough to push him over the threshold. Trey Lance is another example of a player who had a deal that sounded bigger than it actually was, because a lot of the reported value was tied to incentives that were not met. It is a common theme every year, and it is something that makes the compensatory pick process feel like a guessing game until the final numbers are revealed for Cowboys fans. The biggest takeaway is that the compensatory picks are not a guaranteed thing until they are officially announced. Projections can change, and sometimes they change in ways that are painful. In this case, the Cowboys were hit by the reality of snap counts and injury setbacks, and that has shifted the outlook from the 5th-round picks to 1. It is a disappointing outcome, especially when you consider how close Jordan Lewis was to maintaining that 5th-round status. Just 3% of snap percentage is all that separated him from keeping that 5th-round comp pick. That is the kind of margin that feels almost cruel because it is so small and out of the team's control once the season is over. Injuries happen and players miss time, and the compensatory system does not make exceptions for that. It just treats the numbers as they are, and in this case the numbers did not fall in the Cowboys' favor. Despite that, there is still plenty of reason to feel optimistic about the Cowboys' draft outlook. Even with one fewer compensatory pick, the team still has significant draft capital, including the first-round selections that can be used to target impact players. The draft is where the Cowboys can address key needs and bring in talent that fits the identity of the team. Whether they decide to prioritize the offensive line, reinforce the secondary, or add playmakers to the offense, the options are there. The compensatory pick situation might have changed the number of selections, but it does not change the fact that the Cowboys have a strong position in the draft to add young talent. Before we roll on, subscribe to Cowboys Wire News, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Your support keeps the Dallas Cowboys updates coming. Tell us what you think in the comments. Whispers around the league grew louder as word spread that a trade framework involving the Browns has been confirmed internally, with the Cowboys emerging as the aggressive suitor positioning itself to land Myles Garrett, while official paperwork and public statements remain carefully staged. The sense among executives is that Dallas has moved beyond casual interest and into the final stretch of negotiations for one of the NFL's most disruptive defenders. The conversation in front offices is no longer about whether the Cowboys are serious, but about how far they were willing to go to make a statement. Garrett's name has circulated in speculative circles before, yet this time the tone feels different. Sources describe a deal structure that reflects Dallas' belief that its championship window is open right now, and that a transformational pass rusher could tilt the balance of power in the conference. From Cleveland's perspective, the decision appears rooted in long-term planning rather than surrender. The Browns are believed to have secured a package that aligns with a broader reset, giving them flexibility and future assets while moving on from a star whose value may never be higher. Inside the league, there is a quiet respect for the timing, even if fans struggle with the idea of losing a franchise cornerstone in Dallas. The potential arrival of Garrett is being framed as a culture move as much as a football one. His reputation as a relentless, game-altering presence fits the identity the Cowboys have been chasing, and there is confidence that pairing him with existing talent could redefine their defensive ceiling. Coaches are said to be already imagining alignments and matchups that would force opponents into uncomfortable decisions snap after snap until pen meets paper. This remains a rumor wrapped in confirmation, a deal acknowledged but not yet unveiled. Still, the consensus around the league is clear. If this trade is finalized as expected, it will reshape narratives, ambitions, and expectations in both cities, signaling that bold moves are once again on the table. That's a wrap from Cowboys Wire News. For breaking Cowboys updates, subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Tell us your take in the comments.